Evening, wherever you are. And you're very welcome to this webinar on how to successfully publish, hosted by the Journal of Wound Management, which is the official journal of the European Wound Management Association. Next slide. Thank you. So just as a notice to all of you, as we go along, we won't be taking questions after each presenter, but we'd ask you to put your questions and comments into the chat box, and then at the end, we will try to respond to those. Next slide. So I want you to meet the team. These are the people who've been behind the scenes preparing for this afternoon's or this evening's webinar. So John Ivory is a PhD candidate in the University of Galway, and he's an editorial board member of Journal of Wound Management. Dr. Duygu Sezgin is also a lecturer in University of Galway and an editorial board member of Journal of Wound Management. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Professor Sebastian Probst, who is an editorial board member, but is also immediate past president of EWMA, and he's from the HESSO University of Applied Science and Arts in Western Switzerland. And my name is Georgina Gethin. I am the editor of Journal of Wound Management from the School of Nursing and Midwifery in University of Galway, Ireland. So you're very welcome to the session. So next slide. So, and just tap it again, please, Anne, until we get all, thank you. So just what we're going to do over the next 40 minutes or so is talk you through from your initial idea for a paper, whether that is something you're thinking about, a topic that you wish to review, or it may be the results of a research project. So what happens as you go through the submission, the editorial review, the peer review, re-review, which happens all the time, and then final publication, and then letting your paper off into the ether. So what are the steps that are required here? Next slide. So I'm going to hand you over in a few minutes to John Ivory, who's going to talk you through a little bit of information around the publication process. So Journal of Wound Management is a diamond open access, double-blind, peer review journal. And John is going to explain what that means, but not only explaining it, but why that's important and why that would help you in choosing which journal to make your submission to. So John, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Georgina. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Okay, so a lot of us will probably or probably not have heard of the concepts of open science, open research, and open scholarship, and they're used in different contexts by different stakeholders. Open scholarship is the most broad of those three concepts, and it's different from the other two in that it includes the idea of education or open education. So open scholarship then is a means of ethically managing the products of research, education, and knowledge sharing to optimize contribution and collaboration by other groups, individuals, or entities. Excuse me. And the idea is to allow sharing amongst a wider community in terms of reproduction, reuse, and distribution, being mindful of legitimate restrictions to data sharing, such as GDPR or maybe possibly patents, etc. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the concept of open science then, and that's based on 4 principles. The first of these is open access, and it means that all peer-reviewed publications will be published under gold or platinum open access, and I'll talk about those concepts in a few minutes. The idea is that data will be shared as widely and as openly as possible, but again, keeping in mind legitimate restrictions in terms of confidentiality, security, sensitivity. Open science, the second principle then is fair data management, and FAIR is an acronym for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So findable means that your work is easily discovered, and that means that it's cited with a digital object identifier or DOI number. It needs to be accessible to as wide a range of end users as possible. It should be interoperable, which means that it can be used across different systems, different organizations, different entities. And it should be reusable so that somebody can take your research and maybe develop new research questions from it, or possibly verify that data, reproduce it, and make sure that it's just verify what you've done. The third principle then would be sharing, outreach, and engagement, and that would cover public and patient involvement, I imagine. And then finally, you've got the concept or the principle of citizen science, and that means that you need to have a communication and dissemination plan that includes the citizen. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about open access publishing. Now, we're all familiar with, yeah, just back one for a minute. Thank you. So we're all familiar with the traditional subscription-based publishing model, where a company like Sage or Black & Wiley or Springer will take a manuscript from an author, put it through the peer review process, edit it, copy edit it, typeset it, and make it presentable for publication. But then it gets put behind a paywall, and subscription is limited to those who can actually pay, or who have subscription through their institution. So, for example, I was just looking at an article today produced by the Journal of Wound Care, and access to that article would cost me, if I didn't have subscription, would cost me £30 for 30 days. So there are problems visualized or seen with that. The first is that it's thought to restrict, to slow down the research process by limiting access. And what happens is that you have users divided into those who can actually access, who can pay, and those who can't. And the other problem then is that this for-profit model can drive up subscription costs, and that can be problematic for everybody. Apparently, Harvard have even found the whole maintaining access or maintaining subscription costs to be challenging and problematic. So to solve this problem, or to overcome this problem, a group of small publishers came up with the idea of open access publishing and making the fruits of research easily accessible to everybody. Can we go to the next slide, please? So open access then means that publications are freely available. There's unrestricted access, no cost to the reader, and restrictions on reuse are limited. Now, this is good for readers because it means that more work in their field becomes more easily available to them. It's good for authors in that work is available to a wider audience, it gets disseminated more widely, and it's good for funders because it means that the research that they're paying for can have a broader impact. Next slide, please. Now, there's two main routes of access to open access publishing. The first is gold access, and this means with gold open access, most permission barriers are removed. Authors retain the copyright, but they must be acknowledged and cited, and that means that free access content, and by that I mean bronze access, is not necessarily open access. Articles are available on publication, and typically you've got two types of open access journal. You've got hybrid open access, and these are subscription based, but they have an open access option, and that would include most Wiley subscription based journals. And you've got fully open access journals where all content in that journal is published as open access. And an example would be our own Journal of Wound Management, or BMJ Open. Can we go to the next slide? So that's gold access. The second route of access is called green access, or self-archiving. What happens here is that a version of the author's manuscript is placed in a repository. That repository, or the version that's deposited, is dependent on the say of the publisher or funder, but access to that manuscript is free. And typically the manuscript that gets made available has been through the peer review process, and the peer reviewer's concerns have been addressed, but it hasn't necessarily been edited or typeset or made presentable for publication. The difference between gold and green is that copyright remains with the publisher or the society affiliated with the title, and there are restrictions on its reuse. Journals and publishers would have their own self-archiving terms and conditions. So, for example, which version of the article can be used and when it may become available in a repository. And this time lapse is known as an embargo period. Typically, they run from 12 months to a year, but I've seen 2 years to 4 year embargo periods as well. So this gives, the idea of this is that while the embargo period is running, the journal has the chance to make as much as they can out of the subscription-based access before the article becomes freely available. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the advantage then is that of open access publishing is that you've got increased usage of your work and availability of your work. So you've got broader distribution, increased visibility, higher citations, downloads, and download figures tend to be sustained for longer. The Creative Commons licensing makes content available widely, and it can be archived pretty much anywhere. Authors, if you go down the gold route, retain their copyright, retain their rights, and there's increased public engagement. So there's no institutional subscription needed for access, so that anybody can access without having to go through their institution, and there's a quicker impact. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Now, with gold access, there are charges known as article processing charges. These are typically levied after article acceptance and before publication. I've seen a range of $1,000 to $10,000 in terms of article processing charges. The average is around $2. BMJ Open, for example, charges £2,163. Now, there are waivers and discounts, for example, for authors based in low-income countries. And in some cases, or in a lot of cases, your institution might negotiate with the publisher so that you can publish as an author, but you won't be out of pocket. So, for example, our own University of Galway, James Hardiman Library, is part of a national consortium of research libraries. They negotiate with publishers so that we can publish open access, but we're not liable, we're not left out of pocket for the costs. The costs go towards article production, such as formatting and indexing service, editorial work, such as peer review, admin support, customer service, marketing, and technical infrastructure, etc., etc. Now, I didn't put in a slide on diamond or platinum open access. Basically, what that means, another term for that is sponsored access. What that means is that it's open access, but without charges to the author. The costs might be covered by a not-for-profit organization or by an institution, but the bottom line is that you get the benefits of peer review and publication, but without having to pay the article processing charges. So that's a very quick rundown of the open access process. I hope it's been of help for you, and thanks very much for your attention. So we'll go on to the next person then.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sebastian Probst, and I have the pleasure now to guide you through the preparing your manuscript for publication. Next slide. So writing takes time, and a good article won't happen the first time. So that means we have hundreds of drafts to write till we have the article like we want to have it. That means every draft helps us to improve the article and make the paper better. What we recommend is when you work with different authors, that you write the first draft, for example, and then the authors, they are using track change data systems. So that means that you see the progression of your article. What is important? Reference your work. reference your work using a reference system. Here we wrote EndNote, but you can use also RefWork or other systems that are helping you to reference to help the citations. Use the different materials that are on web pages, like here on the Journal of Wound Management web page, like the COEs with the signatures. Do that early. Check your grammar. Check check the English. I know sometimes, or the first or second publication, it can be a rejection, and it's a disappointing, but don't give up. As I said at the beginning, each time you revise your paper, it can be better. Next slide. So what are the rules of the authors? What are your rules? And what are your responsibilities? Next slide. So first of all, it is the contribution. The contribution you give to this manuscript. For example, you want to be the first author, so that means you give a substantial contribution to the manuscript. For example, you write the first draft. Then another colleague wants to contribute as well, but it has to be a substantial contribution. It's not, oh, it's my colleague and that's why I put her or him on the publication. So everybody has to contribute. It's clearly described also in the Journal of Wound Management, but you find also all the rules in the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors that this, what the rules are. Next slide. Decide the order of the authorship in advance. Not that you start and then all of a sudden somebody comes and says, oh, I want to be first author, I want to be second author, or I want to be last author. The authors, the first, second, and last are the most important of your manuscript. The first is the one that had the idea, did most of the work, and the last author usually takes the responsibility of this article. Declare everything in the conflict of interest form and check everything before you submit for publication. Most important is the plagiarism. That means check your manuscript. There are different tools out. If you plagiarize other articles, be aware that you do the proper citations. Next slide. So now we go to the submission process. Now it becomes a little bit more practical. Next slide. So first of all, go on our website, EWMA.org, and there you find the author guidelines of the Journal of Wound Management. Download those, read those carefully, and follow those when preparing and structuring your manuscript. Next slide. Then you have to decide, what kind of article do I write? Do I write an original research article? Do I write a review article? Is it more a discussion paper? Or do I present a case study that I just did in clinical practice? Or do I have something that I want to contribute methodologically? Or do I write a short letter to the editor with my opinion, for example? Next slide. Then structure your articles. You have different frameworks available. Here, I suggest to go on the Equator Network.org. There you find all the templates for like the Concert, Strobe, Prisma, Spirit, etc. that help you structure your article. That means you use these templates also when you submit your article. For example, if you have a randomized controlled trial, then use the Concert statement and There you have to show which section is where in the guideline from your paper. So that means if you write about blinding, then you have to cite it in the guideline. I have it on page 3, for example. Next slide. Then for the first big step, how to write a manuscript for research, is the title. Use a sexy title. Use a title that is interesting for readers, because this is the first thing the editor will read, or afterwards the reviewers. So a bad title hurts immediately a good paper. Here you find a little table that I have out of Bowman's publication, how to write a proper title. So don't use keywords, but don't use keywords. Don't use abbreviations. Don't use jargon and humor. You do not use usually geographic locations, but check it with your grammar. Follow the guideline of the journal, and clearly state the point of the article. So it gives the reader an overview what kind of article it is. Why did I say use keywords? Because you cite at the end some keywords. If they are findable also in your title, your article will be found easier in the different databases. Next slide. When you wrote your title, then check that you have less than 15 words about this. This is what we require in the Journal of Wound Management, and the other elements I already said. Next slide, please. Here I have some articles that are published just recently in the Journal of Wound Management. For example, the article of Ramos et al., they used cross-sectional survey, so I know what kind of methodology they used of patients with pressure ulcers. So it's the population that is already in the title. Here is the setting in primary care setting. They were using the location in northern Portugal. You have others like the Diabetic Foot Valley Project, or the impact of pressure injury on quality of life in adults. Here, that's a protocol of a systematic review, so you know exactly what you will expect. Next slide. Then the abstract. The abstract has to be structured. We require that it's no more than 250 words. That means it's not 251 words, but it can be also 190 words if you can produce a concise abstract. But start with the heading background. Give a background. Why do you write this abstract, this paper? Then the aim or the hypothesis, then the design, your findings, the main findings, the results and implications for practice. Next slide. Afterwards, you go to your main manuscript. The introduction is very important. And I wrote those 3 terms. There is, however, therefore, there. So there is, cite what's out there. Show what's the evidence out there. However, I usually use the term however, show what is the gap in the literature. Therefore, I do, or we did this research. Afterwards, you go to the methods and materials. That means you have to explain what you did. You have to think, you have to take the reader on the hand and give all the information that the reader can redo your research. Then with the results, that's important that you report the important results, structure them. What I usually suggest is to use titles and subtitles, so that gives you a better structure and helps the reader better understand your results. One thing that is very important, the results are facts that you present. It's not a discussion. It's not your viewpoint. It's only facts, what you found from your study. Next slide. Afterwards, you have the discussion. There you can discuss the different, the main results of your paper. Show what's out there in the literature. For example, you find something and somebody found something similar, or somebody found something completely different. So that's why it's important that you discuss this. Then show the strength and the limits of your study. Usually it's in the discussion part, or you can use that also as a separate chapter where you write length, strength and limits of the study. Afterwards, it's very, very typical for the Journal of Wound Management, because we want to enhance clinical practice. So that's why we require that you write a chapter about implications for clinical practice. There you give practical tips from your study. That means what you found, what you want, that how you can implement that, for example, in clinical practice, what you found. And then give some recommendations for further research, not only saying, oh, further research has to be done, but help the reader also, oh, this can be very interesting, or that can be very interesting, so that your work can be taken and somebody else can also continue this research. Next slide. This is a little bit an overview for the submission of the manuscript. So first of all, you have to really know the list, write a title page. That means the title page that has to that has your title, that has the different authors with the row of the authors, who's first author, second, third, etc. Usually there are the addresses. Then you write a cover letter. For example, if for the Journal of Wound Management, dear Professor Gethin, I would like to submit this paper. Show also in the letter of editor that this document, that this paper has never been published before, or has not been submitted to another journal on the same time. Then do the acknowledgements. Acknowledgements, it's everybody that was helping you, for example, for this study. Acknowledgement is also that you can say thank you to the patients that are included in the study. It can be if a colleague, physician, or nurse was helping you. This is all in the acknowledgement, and they all those people that are not in as an author. Then you have the main file with no identifiers, and then you have, that means that you have to submit the manuscript without your names. Be careful also, blind the number of ethics, the ethic committee, for example, where you did the data collection, so that the reviewer does not recognize from where this paper comes. Then you have the conflict of interest that you have to declare, and very important, suggest some reviewers. So this helps the editor and the editorial team to give that to somebody to review. Of course, it's not your colleague at work, but somebody that is expert in this particular field. Next slide. Now, how to submit an article. You open the Journal of Wound Management web page, then go under Submit Paper. On the left, you see the dashboard with probably you submitted already some papers. Otherwise, you go directly to the submission guidelines and read them again. Next slide. Then you have to put the different authors, the names in there. If you're not registered, you have to register yourself, and then you add the different author names. Afterwards, on the right, you see you have to put your title in there. Then you have to choose what kind of article type you have. Then you continue with all the different fields that are required to submit a paper. Next slide. You have to choose your keywords. You have to have here for us 5 relevant keywords. You can choose those from different keyword trees, and then you have to glide them in the submission page. Afterwards, you have to upload the anonymized manuscript. You have to choose what kind of manuscript it is, and then you upload that. Next one. Then you suggest reviewers, as I already said. Next slide. You write a letter to the editor, and then you will push the button for submission, and you have to review your submission. You have to approve it. And one thing that is important, this is not a process of 5 minutes. It can take at least an hour or a little bit longer, because you have to check everything thoroughly. Now I would like to hand over to Professor Gethin.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for that. So now you have your paper written. You've clicked the button that says submit. So what happens next? Next slide. So as the editor, we receive notification when a paper has been submitted through the system. And this will be allocated either to me as editor or to somebody else as an associate editor, particularly if it's a special edition. And we review it at the first hurdle. And sometimes this paper will be rejected before it is reviewed. The reason for that is that it may not have adhered to the author guidelines. People often forget to take their name and address and everything out of the main manuscript, so we cannot send it out for peer review when that's there. Or it might be something like they don't have ethical approval for the study, so therefore we will no longer consider it. And sometimes, unfortunately, the quality of the paper is not of a standard that would meet our processes for the journal. So in those cases, it is rejected before it is sent out for peer review. First hurdle, we then identify reviewers to send it out to. So as Professor Probst said, you can suggest reviewers. There's no guarantee that we will ask those reviewers. For example, you may have suggested a reviewer that we have already asked 3 times this year, and we do not wish to burden people. But all papers will have a minimum of 2 reviewers. But depending on the paper, sometimes it can be very difficult to get reviewers for a paper. It might be very, very specialized. It could be the time of year to get people. So sometimes we may have to go up to 7, 8, 9 in order to get 2 people to agree to review. They will then send a response back to us, and that response goes back to the authors. And Duygu is going to go through more of the steps around responding to the reviewers. But essentially, it's sent back to the authors. The authors then have an opportunity to respond. That goes back to the reviewer to see if you've met their criteria, back again to the editor, back to the author again. and then it goes into the production stage. So there's a lot of stages involved in this. And what that means is that the peer review process does take time. This does not happen in 1 or 2 weeks. It can take quite a few weeks. So you have to allow time for that, unless there's a very special circumstance that one may wish to have something published very rapidly. So I'm going to hand you over to Duygu, who's going to take you through the next steps.
Thank you very much, Georgina. Now I'm going to talk about responding to reviewers. Next slide, please. So it's an important moment when you have the email notification from the editor. It's most likely that you will see the decision somewhere. They will highlight that the outcome is either, unfortunately, a rejection or good news, your paper is accepted. So it's very rare to have something accepted straight away. It's very typical to have a round or 2 of revisions. So in that case, the author and the reviewers' comments will be there, and you'll be asked to submit a revision. So what do you need to do for this? Next slide, please. If it's bad news, if your manuscript is rejected, there are certain reasons. Georgina earlier highlighted some of them, and Sebastian mentioned some of the reasons they are unacceptable for publication. So if you look at them, mainly they're about content, because if there are some essential problems such as ethics or your paper not being within the scope of the journal, then it won't make it to the peer review process. It will be rejected by the editor at that early stage. But if it goes through the peer review, then the common issues are typically around justification, for example. If you didn't explain the gap in the gap in the knowledge and what needs to be done, and your justification to conduct that research, write that paper, and the contribution of your manuscript to the literature, that's an important one. Other reasons, these are just examples. There could be other reasons, but such as incomplete data, your sample size being very small, or if you haven't justified your data analysis approach, or how you recruited participants, justification of these very briefly. That's why, as earlier mentioned, as Sebastian mentioned, using a framework, a checklist to make sure you cover everything. Sometimes I volunteer as a peer reviewer sometimes, and I see discussion section repeating the results, or drawing some manuscripts. I remember examples of reaching some conclusions, but they are not mentioned before in the results section. So conclusions or implications to practice not being supported by the data. That's another issue there. So it could be one individual factor, but it's most likely it will be a combination of these factors. Next, please. So the other issues briefly, if the overall quality and presentation, academic language, or overall language is really poor, that could be a factor, but depends. If your topic is really interesting, if you're presenting a very strong research, if there are any edits needed for the academic language or overall English, the reviewers will get back to you with comments saying, please improve the academic or the language. So there will be feedback about that. But in many cases, it's not a reason on its own for rejection. But if it's really poorly written, then in that case, if it's not possible to understand the content, what you're presenting there, it could be a significant issue there for rejection. And ethical issues earlier mentioned by Georgina. So not having ethics approval, if it made to the peer review process, and if it's noticed at that stage, it's an issue. You'll be asked about this. And other reasons such as publication ethics, if it's published elsewhere previously, or any academic integrity issues such as plagiarism, or any use of AI undeclared and to the extent that it's not allowed. So this could be an important issue also. Next slide, please. Okay, when you first get that email, let's think about the scenario of major revisions. It may look and feel worse than it is. So you probably need some time to process this information and accept that there are some issues with the manuscript and you need to address these changes. I really don't recommend that you react immediately and just immediately send the revisions, because they need time. Some of them, if it's especially if it's major revision, it will need time. So read everything very carefully and note your deadlines. It's very important. Next slide, please. You need to make a plan how you will address the reviewer comments. So read everything and think about what's the answer to their questions or what they're asking and how you will address them. As I mentioned earlier, peer reviewers are volunteers. So they are the experts from the area, and their purpose is not to challenge you, your field, your research, but they just want to make your manuscript better. So more people will read it and it will be scientific. So if there is any unclarities, they need to be addressed before it's accepted, because that's very important. In some cases, you may disagree with the comments sent by the peer reviewers. Of course, you should be arguing about this in a professional way with a clear communication and justify your points, why you disagree and why it should be written that way. Of course, you need to give scientific evidence with supporting literature while you're doing this rebuttal. Next, please. Here's an example. I've seen many people addressing reviewer feedback like this, but there are other ways to respond to reviewers. So you need to be very organized, because you should not miss anything, because it's important. It may lead to rejection decision if you inadequately address the reviewer comments. So in this case, we have reviewer 1 and reviewer 2. So what they did, what you can do, for example, 2 reviewers, you can go reviewer by reviewer. Don't forget to acknowledge positive feedback, because it's also important there. And if they're asking for a change, so then you need to make changes and highlight that where, on what page. You can give page number, you can give direct quotes about the change happened, so the reviewers can find them easily when they see the manuscript again. It's important to highlight the changes. Sometimes you receive instructions about how you highlight them, either in simple yellow highlight or changing the text color. It's usually not recommended to do track changes because sometimes things can be missed. Depending on that, just to make sure you show what changes are made in a clear way. Next, please. Proofreading is another very important point. In the field of medicine and healthcare, it's very common to have large team of authors. So if you're the lead author, corresponding author, then what you need to do, preparing the first draft and then sending them to your author team so they can review, they can give their own feedback. So this will take time. So have your deadline and prepare to meet the deadline, and you should give enough time to have these edits ready. By the way, there might be several rounds of revisions. It doesn't mean that you have the decision, it's major revision. It doesn't mean once you submit it, it will be accepted. It may, but it may not. Then next time they might ask for further revisions based on what else is missing from after the first revision, because in some cases, authors don't adequately respond to the reviewer questions or recommendations. If there is anything missing, that's not so ideal. So you need to capture everything. In the next round, you might get a minor revision. It's still not guaranteed that your paper will be accepted. So you need to take this process very seriously. Next, please. Common problems at that stage if your paper is rejected at that stage. As I said earlier, maybe you do not respond to all queries highlighted by the editor or the reviewers. That's an important one. By the way, these are only examples. There could be other reasons. After the revisions, if you still haven't fully explained your points and the rationale, that could be another important one. For example, if they asked for the improvement of the language and presentation, but the changes to this are not adequate, so that could be the reason. But every paper is different, every manuscript is different, so there could be other reasons. And the next, please. Then you have the final decision. It could be either the bad news, the rejection, or the accept. If it's accepted, Georgina will soon talk about them, what happens next. But I just want to conclude by saying every submission is an experience. You learn from it because you get constructive feedback from the reviewers. I say the same thing, don't give up, be open to feedback. maybe the timing isn't right, maybe the choice of journal, but it's not a criticism of your work. It's just sometimes it's time to move on, and in this process you learn from your peers. It's important to get your mentors' feedback, or even your colleagues' papers. That's another learning experience, and overall you learn as you have decisions from editors. In the case of acceptance, now we will move back to Georgina, and she'll talk about promoting your paper.
Thank you so much, Duygu, for taking us through all of that. And I think it's important to say that every single one of us and every single author out there has had rejection at some point. So it's rejected and you move on. So now that it's accepted, the good news. Next slide. Essentially, and Tabit, if it was worth writing it, then it's worth reading it. And do not for a minute think that somehow out of some form of a miracle that the world is going to know about your paper and it's going to read it and cite it and promote it. It is up to you to now do the work to say, look, I have written this paper, it is worthy of people reading it, and I need to start to promote it. Next slide. So I've taken some of this from other sites as to how to promote your paper, but only last week, a colleague sent me an email with a link to his most recent publication. He emailed me to tell me about his publication. Number one, because he's proud of it, but also because it's a way of letting people know that this paper is now published. Use your social media to promote it. When you go into your paper online, you will always see a small little icon that says share. If you use that to share your paper through Twitter, through LinkedIn, through whatever social media platforms you have, you're able to do that. And that brings people directly to the paper. Use other things like ResearchGate or whatever profiles you use. Put it out there. And sometimes don't do it just once. You should perhaps go back about a month later. No harm to promote it again. Make sure your co-authors are doing the same. Update your profile to include your publication on all of your platforms, particularly if you've got a university profile or if you have ResearchGate or one of those. Remember, there are restrictions, and John went through this about the actual article. There are restrictions that you may not be able to publish the actual article, but you may be able to publish the link to the article where people then can try and download it. As I say, your institutional homepage. Contact your press office. If this is something really innovative or something that has whole new results, your press office will be delighted to put out good news stories about staff in their institution. So don't be afraid to use them in order to promote your work. Write a lay summary of your paper. Platforms such as Kudos are great for being able to put in a lay summary. What does the ordinary person need to know about this paper? Some will even allow you to do a short video abstract. Get creative. If you're not good at it, I guarantee you have a friend who is really good at it. Make short little 1-2 minute videos that tells a story about your paper. Mention it at conferences. Now, you know, sometimes you have presenters who go up and they only present their own work. That does not go down very well, really, but you should be able to present it within your conference presentations. Check indexing services to make sure that your paper is listed with correct details. And then upload your accepted manuscript, not the final one. So John talked about self-archiving, and make sure to do that, because uploading it to your institutional site increases the number of times that your paper is found. If you do not have an ORCID ID, you absolutely should have an ORCID ID. Just Google ORCID ID, it will bring you into the site and you set up an account and you can have all of your publications on that site. Next slide. There are other methods of monitoring your paper. So what's very interesting is to say, okay, I've published my paper and I now know that there's 50 citations of my paper, but I have no idea where they are unless I really do a lot of work. So metrics such as Altmetrics and Plumex are very good for that. And I'll give you an example of those. So the next slide. So you can go into your paper And you can see up on the top left-hand corner, you've got this lovely colored icon. So those colors are not by accident. They refer to something. But what we can see is this paper has had, in Scopus alone, 51 citations. If I went into Google Scholar, it's probably more. But I can see, if I go down on that, that 49 of those were by papers that are published in Scopus. 8 were by those that are published in PubMed Central. But I can also see that 2 of those papers were included in policy. That's really, really important. And that's a really good capture for me. So I can click on that and see what policy documents they have been captured in. So that shows you the wider impact of your work beyond just simply it has had 51 citations. Next slide. So what you can see when you look at the colors and you look at the arrows I've put in, I see that red arrow shows me there's 51 citations, and therefore on the little red bubble, that shows me the size of the bubble and therefore the number of citations. If I had 150, that bubble is going to be bigger. And the purple is the number of readers, the number of people who've actually captured that. So that gives me a very good indication of my paper. The next slide. And this is another one. This is altmetric. So you can see all the colors that are in this. And the colors are not by, they're not just a design feature. So what this tells me is for red, this has been captured in 1 news outlet. It's been captured on 1 blog. It's been on 2 Facebook pages and on 3 Wikipedia pages. Now, really, really, and I don't mind saying this, a really good paper might have an altmetric score of about 700, you know. So 34 is probably on the low side, but it is what it is. But it's a really good way of seeing where your paper goes and the level of interest in it. Next slide. And then this is just my final slide. Make sure that you have, if you're starting out, particularly as an early career researcher, you're starting out in a publication journal, make sure that you're on ResearchGate, make sure you have your ORCID ID. And I would suggest using LinkedIn as well, because LinkedIn is very much a professional platform, whereas Twitter and some of those can be a mix of social and professional. So the next slide. So I just want to thank you for your attention. Please put in some questions if you have any. This webinar will be free later on for anybody who wishes to watch it. So it's not just for those who have been able to attend live. Next slide. And just a quick reminder, we have our conference in London coming up in 2 weeks' time, and we hope to be able to see you there. The journal will be very much present at the conference. And the final slide. And you will see a lot of our publications available at the conference that you are free to pick up a hardbound copy, or we will have QR codes where you'll be able to download a copy as well. So I just want to thank all of our presenters for taking the time to prepare and to present to you today. And if you have questions, as I say, please post them. And thank you so much for your attention and for coming online. So I have one question here in the chat, and it says, I wanted to discuss how study methods such as RCTs play a crucial role in determining acceptance criteria. It is evident that validity, the study design and being a gold standard. So thank you for your question. Basically, if it is a randomized control trial, then it must be reported according to the consort checklist. So Sebastian earlier mentioned about going on to the equatornetwork.org. So when you go into that network, you will see a list of protocols or templates for how to report various types of studies. So whether that's a randomized controlled trial or an observational study or a case series, go into that, find the template, and if you adhere to those guidelines, your chances of successful publication will actually go much higher. But submitting the likes of a randomized controlled trial without reference to that will very much increase your chances of rejection. So I hope that answers that question. Do we have any other questions? Even from our panel may have one.
Thank you, Georgina, for your explanation. I have another question. Is there, if I submit a paper, do you use always the same reviewers for the second review?
Thanks, Sebastian. Really good question. We try to use the second reviewer, the same reviewers the second time around. Sometimes it will not go back to the reviewers if, as an editor, I feel that everything has been adequately addressed. However, in some cases, it could be a different set of reviewers. And in some other journals, that can be a real problem. And I will give you a personal example. We submitted a review, a systematic review to a journal. We had 4 reviewers the first time who recommended revisions to the paper. It was revised and it went back out to 3 different reviewers. So actually that paper had 7 reviewers plus an editorial review. But for us, we try to keep it to the same reviewers, but it's not a guarantee. And I just see if there's another one. So I had a good question. If the Equator guidelines don't have a guideline for your type of article, do we put that in or use the closest? I think Equator has so much in there that it's unlikely you will not find the checklist for your paper. However, I would then recommend using the closest to that if that is what is appropriate. And if in doubt, you can always write to an editor and ask them. Thank you for the lovely comments coming through.
Georgina, I have another question. When we start writing our article, what is the length of our article that we have to submit?
Thank you for that, Sebastian. So how long is a piece of string? The author guidelines will give an indication of the word count for various types of articles. So for example, if you're submitting I can't remember the exact count offhand, but if you're submitting a case series, it would be far less, for example, than a systematic review. So the length of the article will depend on the type of study that is in. In some cases, if it goes over that, you would need to justify why. And some of the material might be able to be put into a supplementary file that is online. But generally speaking, 3,000 words is usually sufficient for the vast majority of articles. And I suppose the great skill in writing, and as people write better and more often, they learn how to be much tighter in their writing. You know, lose the flowery language. It is lovely, but it's not really appropriate to your research articles. So be tight in your language, keep to the main point, and I would say no more than 3,000 words. But I say it could be justified depending on the type of a study, but I would try to keep to that. Thank you. Okay. So I think we have come to the end of our session. And once again, thank you to EWMA. And I should have mentioned, and I'm really, really sorry, behind the scenes, a huge thanks to Anne and Amelia, who have done a fantastic job in preparing for this and in keeping us all on track during this webinar. Please share it with your friends. There's a link there that can be shared later on. And we look forward to you submitting to Journal of Wound Management. So thank you, everybody, to our presenters and for you, the audience. Bye-bye.